live on YouTube. And we're live on Zoom, so we will wait just another minute or so. I see there's a rush of late registrants, which is very nice. Wow. Thank you for joining us, everybody. And always remember that if you can't get on Zoom, if the maximum is reached, or if you are unable to register for the Zoom meeting, the program is on YouTube, on the Nasser YouTube channel at the same time. It's the same thing. And there's no limit to the number of people who can be on YouTube. So that it has that advantage as well. So we'll get started in just a couple of seconds. All right, we'll get started right now then, in fact. I want to say good afternoon or good evening to all of you who are joining us on one of the last weekends of the very strange summer of 2020. And I, in particular, want to thank the co-sponsors of today's program, two excellent organizations that we're very proud to work with, the Society for Armenian Studies and its president, Bedros Dermatosyan, and the Ararat Eskidjan Museum and its director, Maggie Mangasarian Goshen. And we have Maggie with us here today, and I would like to invite her to say a few words. So thanks for being with us, Maggie, as always.
Thank you, Mark. I really appreciate it. And thank you for being a great mentor to me. We've been working with NASA since 2006, and Mark has been exceptional directing me and introducing me to new and upcoming scholars. In fact, he introduced me to Stefan Ihrig a few years back, but it has been a little bit difficult to secure it. Stefan is so busy, but because of the pandemic, somehow online worked out for our benefit. For those of you who are joining us, I'm Maggie with the Ararat Eskidjan Museum, and if you're wondering, this mouthful name, Ararat-Eskidjan Museum, we are nestled in Los Angeles in the city of Mission Hills, and predominantly it's a nursing and an elderly home. And they had a vision to continue the legacy of the elders, to open a museum and a chapel and a research center. And the founder of the museum is Mr. Luther Eskidjan, who survived the genocide. He came in at the age of 7, and he had a vision to open a repository, and he collected all his life. He was an architect in profession. He built it at the age of 78, the museum and the chapel, and thus his collection became the foundation of the museum. And we've added to his collection, and we're still adding more and more and more. We have 3 libraries, and one library is housed Professor Robert Houston's entire research library. We have a small portion of Hakan Dadrian's extensive library, very small portion. And we also have 2 archival rooms that we are housing Robert Houston's archive and Professor Hakan Dadrian's entire personal notes and archives. We've already indexed Professor Dadrian's archives, and we're working on indexing it. And hopefully when Professor Akjam is in town, he'll be giving us a hand and review the archives and then make it available for the researchers in the future. So for those of you who are joining us, please tune in for exceptional programs that Mark puts together. And here and there, I try to collaborate with him. We have an excellent team in LA. I call it the LA Nasser team, and as well as the Boston team. And for those of you who haven't read Professor Ihrig's 2 volumes that I go crazy about, and I always brag about it, it's been a few years, but still I highly recommend it. And Nasser Bookstore has an excellent bookstore that they can provide you. Again, thank you, Stefan. I've reached my bucket list with your lecture today. Thank you. Thanks, Mark. It's up to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie, and really congratulations to Ararat Eskidjan for the incredible additions to your library over the past couple of years with Dr. Houston and Dr. Dadrian's collections. These are first-class materials that are really going to be valuable for researchers, so good job. I want to mention one upcoming event, which is going to be on Monday, September 14th. Maggie mentioned Taner Akjam, and this will be a lecture, online lecture by Taner Akjam. When was the decision made to annihilate the Armenians? On Monday, September 14th. And this event is organized by the Promise Armenian Institute at UCLA and is co-sponsored by the Ararat Museum, Nasser, the Richard Hovhannissian Endowed Chair in Modern Armenian History at UCLA, and the UCLA Center for Near Eastern Studies. So we certainly hope you can be with us online on September 14th for that. Our speaker today is indeed Dr. Stefan Ihrig. Dr. Ihrig is a professor of history at the University of Haifa in Israel and director of the Haifa Center for German and European Studies. And it is from there that he is joining us today, rather in the middle of the night for him, and in the early evening for us here in Boston. Dr. Ihrig is the author of several books: The German Language, Who Are the Moldovans from 2008, Ataturk in the Nazi Imagination, published by Harvard University Press in 2014. I have them right here so I can hold them up. And Justifying Genocide, Germany and the Armenians from Bismarck to Hitler, Harvard University Press, 2016. And these books are indeed available from the Nasser bookstore, and would certainly encourage you, if you have not purchased it, to buy it at your earliest convenience. For Justifying Genocide, Dr. Ihrig received Nasser's 2017 Sonia Aronian Book Prize for Excellence in Armenian Studies, and a very deserving recipient indeed he is, and the book is. It certainly has been the wish of both Maggie and me for several years to have Dr. Ihrig as a speaker, so it is a pleasure finally to have the opportunity to congratulate him in person almost, and to introduce him and to welcome him through the magic of the internet. A reminder that questions must be submitted through the Q&A function on Zoom, and we will get to as many as we can following Dr. Ihrig's talk. As always, I humbly request that they be on topic and brief. The title of Dr. Ihrig's talk today is The Armenian Genocide and the 20th Century, and we welcome him. Dr. Ihrig.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you so much, Maggie, for having me. It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure to talk to you, also to give a talk in this context, even if it's only on Zoom. Instead of hopping a plane halfway around the world, I come to you live from my desk at home, which is really strange for me. We are teaching online on Zoom, and I still find this very strange not to be able to see and interact with my audience. And in addition to all of that, I decided to forego a PowerPoint presentation today because you know how it is, then the speaker becomes a small stamp on the side of the screen, and also because today's topic is perhaps not the best for illustrations. But I will do my best not to be boring and to be relatively precise. At the same time, also, I know that some of you heard me already speak or read something that I wrote. I'm trying to catch you all, basically presenting some of my past research together with some newer ideas. As you know, my book on the Armenian Genocide in Germany came out 4 years ago. Now I'm working on a different book and a different topic, and still the Armenian Genocide doesn't really let me go. Why is that? This is what I'm going to talk to you about today. And we could start in many places with this topic today. We could start with the way war is waged today, new kinds of warfare, for example, striking enemies by drones, you know, from a far distance, people sitting halfway across the world with a joystick, guiding drones. And this whole package where collateral damage, i.e. civilian casualties, have become fairly acceptable to us today. This is a development of the last years and decades, and this too, I would argue, is connected to the Armenian Genocide. We could start with fake news and the decline in general of the notion of truth in public discourse, and this too, I would argue, is connected to the history of the Armenian Genocide. And if you listen carefully now, I said not the Armenian Genocide, but the history of the Armenian Genocide, and there's a reason. This talk today is about what this genocide means for the 20th century. The Armenian Genocide and its role for the 20th century, for its history. And here the Armenian Genocide has basically its own life. You know, it develops its own history in the course of the whole 20th century. Let's start differently. Why is this topic not letting me go? Because I feel there is something fundamentally wrong about how it is being perceived and how it is part or not part of our understanding of 20th century history today. So this talk today is also a plea not to think that recognition of the genocide is an endpoint, but rather the beginning of a new phase regarding the topic of the Armenian Genocide. And this is perhaps one of my core messages today. Now that recognition has been widely achieved, I think it is time to try to understand what kind of an effect over 100 years of denialism has had on the history or on history writing and on teaching history, what kind of an effect over 100 years of denialism has had on how we understand the larger puzzle of modern history. Let me illustrate this, starting off with one aspect. You all know that in the last decade, there were a number of new grand histories of World War I. You know, in all the major languages, you had many, many new histories of this great conflict, World War I, the Great War. And when you now take a look at these books, if you have any around at home, and take a look where and how, if at all, the Armenian Genocide is featured there. Unfortunately, I would say from my reading of these new publications or latest publications, the Armenian Genocide often only features as an addendum. Somewhere, you know, this also happened. It's not integral to the larger story. It's like a historical appendix. Might hurt, but you could just as well cut it out of the story. It's not integral to it, and I believe this is a really fundamentally wrong approach to the Armenian Genocide and its role in history. Now, don't misunderstand me, and Mark has these books standing behind him, probably in the shelves. We have lots of historians who have done great things in the last years on our topic on the Armenian Genocide. Many of them are, you know, connected to the topic either from a biographical background or a specific disciplinary background, especially many of the newcomers. And here now we have also people from Turkey or coming from Turkish studies, which is great. But it's been a century. And what we need now, I think, is for general historians and for general histories to try to understand the role of the Armenian Genocide and to incorporate it into their topics of interest and into the larger picture. So now I have described how the Armenian Genocide is not part of general history. So why and how should it be? Let's begin sort of chronologically how it came to the knowledge of the world at the time when it happened. This topic now would be so-called atrocity propaganda. Right when World War I started, propaganda or the propaganda war also started. And in this case, it was a battle over who is more righteous, who is more civilized. And the fact that there were still countries which were neutral or undecided was crucial in this, you know, initial energy for this propaganda war, and especially, of course, the United States, which was neutral for some time during World War I. So whenever there was something that might fit the propaganda machines of Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire on the one side, or Britain, France, Russia, and later also Italy on the other side, try to connect it to morality, humanity, notions of civilization. One side bombarded an open city, the other side screamed how barbarous they were. A civilian ship was attacked, barbarians. Enemy civilians were interned and apparently mistreated, the uncivilized English. The Germans committed murder in Belgium, the Huns are on the loose. And so it continued daily across the newspapers of the world, often in morning and evening editions, often manifold in the same pages, many topics. And so it continued for weeks, months, for almost 3/4 of a year, until you could read about what was happening to the Armenians for the first time in the summer of 1915. So now that this topic came up in the summer of 1915, was this just another piece of atrocity propaganda, or was it more? The Germans, the Austrians, the Ottomans, and even the Americans, diplomats and experts, they knew of the realities on the ground at the time when it was happening. And still, until the war was over, both sides, Entente and Central Powers, used the Armenian topic alongside of many other atrocity examples in their propaganda battle back and forth. As a newspaper reader or a soldier at the time, you couldn't really know for sure what happened. And then after the war, not many measures were taken to clear it up. There were proceedings in Istanbul, as you know, but the world now had to deal with other more pressing topics, or so it thought, and a series of other problems all around the globe. Clearing up the many lies produced by wartime propaganda and educating their respective populations of what really happened was not really on the agenda. So whether or not it was true what had been written about the Armenians during the war was never really elaborated upon in public discussion after the war, except in Germany, and I worked on that, where the discussion went all wrong in the end. And you have to understand there were lots of things coming out to the public view in these years. The British famously had their official documentation publication on the Armenian Genocide, the German Foreign Office as well. Before that, on other topics, the Bolsheviks published formerly secret diplomatic correspondence on a whole series of topics. And then, to top it off, during World War I, the British had taken over the former German colony of Southwest Africa during the war. And then right away had started to research and do interviews about the genocide of the Herero and Namakwa people, which happened a decade before World War I. And after World War I, they published a blue book on this genocide. So all this kind of official activity of clearing things up, for many people had just more of an air of more propaganda, that people kind of were trying now to justify past propaganda by putting out more publications. To cut this story short, when during World War II, news of the Holocaust and later about the gas chambers of the extermination camps, like in Auschwitz and other places, reached the West, many were prone to initially dismiss these reports because they felt it feels too much like World War I atrocity propaganda, what was being reported there, and they were afraid in their own propaganda to repeat what they believed were mistakes of World War I. So in a way, because of how the Armenian Genocide had been framed, contextualized, and presented during World War I and afterwards, this also made it more difficult for the world to understand what was happening to the Jews during the Holocaust, even if news, and often accurate news, reached the West. And I want to stress it again, the Armenian topic is not just one of many, but is crucial. Crucial also for the larger topic of atrocities in public discourse around the world. In Germany, for example, and I've been talking about this before, in Germany, for example, the reading public had been exposed in 3 distinct periods of time to extensive reporting and public debate on the slaughtering of Armenians. During the 1819 massacres under Abdul Hamid II, during World War I, when actually German propaganda tried to deny what was happening to the Armenians too much and covered it actually too extensively to fulfill the kind of scope that they had in mind. And then after World War I, there was this extensive debate from 1919 to 1923. I argue the first genocide debate in the world, and a really extensive one at that. And in this context, I always use this quote, and I think it's really a crucial one, from a German pro-Armenian activist who was also a Protestant pastor, Martin Rader. This one is now from the 1890s, so before the Armenian Genocide, after Germany had this extensive debate on what was happening in these series of pogroms, massacres across the Ottoman Empire. And he's reflecting on how much the German public and the government, channels, government newspapers, the government kind of propaganda, how they had been working to excuse and justify the killing of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. So now a direct quote from this pro-Armenian activist, Martin Rader. It is impossible to appreciate what kind of impression the fashion in which society and the press are discussing the Armenian horrors will make on the generation of men growing up today. They are learning to worship an idol of opportunism and realpolitics, which, if it becomes dominant, will cleanse away all noble dispositions. End of quote. And for me, this quote always highlights something that a lot of historians often underestimate or neglect a bit. The fact that the world knew of things going on almost simultaneously, and this is already true from the late 19th century onwards. Newspapers often had many editions in a day. They had connections to international news agents, their own reporters in other cities around the world, connected to them by telegraph. In the press of the big countries or the big cities of the world, international affairs were discussed all the time. For example, the Ottoman Empire was not far away at all for newspaper audiences in the 1890s in Germany or Britain or France, for example. They would read about the Ottoman Empire all the time if anything of note was happening. So what this awareness of, for example, atrocity and massive violence abroad, in our example in the Ottoman Empire, but also in the colonial spaces, what this did to the moral, philosophical and political thinking of contemporaries in various places around the world, we cannot really know. Most of the time there are few or no sources of people reflecting on what they're reading in the news and how it influences them. But it doesn't mean that these things did not have actually an impact, an effect on people. And this is something I think we should pay more attention to also as historians. These things, looking back, sometimes might appear far away, unconnected, or niche topics. But just take a look at the newspapers of the times, for example, the 1890s, and see that people are engaging with these topics, and they have to come to terms also with instances of violence, even if they're far away and in seemingly unconnected places. Now, this brings me to the next major point. What was the message of the Armenian Genocide? And this sounds really strange, I admit that. Do genocides have messages? Unfortunately, I think they do. How did the world react? What did they do to help? How are the perpetrators punished? How is justice carried out afterwards? What happens to perpetrators and victims after genocide? And now again, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, or perhaps into the middle of things. A quote from a young Jewish woman caught up in one of the Nazi-imposed ghettos in occupied Poland. Her name is Inka Weiborg, and she was reading Franz Werfel's novel, The 40 Days of Musa. I'm sure that you know this book. It's about the Armenian Genocide, of course. So here, Inka Weiborg reading this in a ghetto. This is before the ghettos, of course, are cleaned and people are deported to extermination camps like Auschwitz, Belzec, and other places. So Inka Weiborg wrote in her memoirs, "For 4 full days, I was engrossed in the book and I couldn't tear myself away. I myself was at Musa. I was under siege. I was one of the Armenians doomed to death. If I lifted my eyes from the book, it was only to hear the cry," her own words actually, "Mama, how could this be?" The world knew and it kept silent. It could not be that the children in other countries at the same time went to school, women adorned themselves, men went about their business as if nothing happened. And there a people was annihilated. End of quote. We have many of those. I'll give you another one. This one is from William Michel, who was in the Kovno ghetto. He relates how the book was read basically in a group of people and how people discussed the book while reading it in the ghetto at the time. This is, I think, from 43. Quote, "We compared their fate to ours, the indifference of the world to their plight, and the complete abandonment of the poor people into the hands of a barbarous, tyrannical regime. Our analysis of the book indicated that if the world did not come to the rescue of the Armenians, who were Christians after all, how could we Jews expect help? No doubt Hitler knew all about these massacres and the criminal neglect by the free world, and was convinced that he could proceed with impunity against the helpless Jews. Our conclusion was that if we were ever able to survive this war, it would not be because somebody came to our rescue, but because Hitler ran out of time. End of quote. And there are many more quotes like these from the Jews of Europe at the time of the Holocaust, reflecting on their own fate through the prism of the Armenian Genocide. Now, many in the audience, and since I cannot see you, I have to speculate, of course, probably ask themselves, now he's probably mentioning, or why isn't he mentioning the famous Hitler quote, who after all speaks of the extermination of the Armenians today? The reason is that I usually try to show that this is just one quote of many. The debate about its authenticity, it's part of some notes of the meeting. Some other notes don't feature it. There has been a long debate about it. And I think this debate just obscures the fact that interwar Germany and the Nazis especially, they knew about the Armenian genocide. They knew quite a lot. And I won't go much into detail here on the Nazis. I spoke and wrote about this a lot already. And we can do more in question time as well if we want to. But one thing is for sure, they knew, and they knew quite a lot. What's more, they also knew a lot about Ataturk and the Turkish War of Independence that took place from 1919 to 23. The Nazis, they were huge fans. And what they also knew is that the Turks had revised their own Versailles Treaty, the Treaty of Sèvres, and more importantly, they had not really faced any punishment for genocide. Nazi publications on Turkey in the Third Reich make Turkey out to be some sort of most developed modern state, a total success, a post-genocidal wonderland of sorts. And this is not just a spin I'm putting on what the Nazis are writing. This is the core double message that the Nazis had clearly received, and you can show this from their own publications many times over. The first one, no punishment for genocide, and the second one, a single ethnic state, a mono-ethnic state. They simply ignored the existence of other groups like the Kurds and so on, even though they would have featured, in the news at the time in the 20s and 30s. A mono-ethnic state that was now able to achieve miraculous things because it was no longer encumbered by these vicious minority populations. Such were the rewards of genocide, at least in the Nazi perception and in the Nazi publications. And I think in such a perspective, it becomes clear that the Armenian genocide was a crucial step or a crucial component to answering the question, how was it possible that genocide was thinkable as an option in a country like Germany at the time? A piece of evidence I came across only recently. Apparently the German Foreign Office during World War II tried or had the idea to spread knowledge of the Armenian genocide in the world through its embassies abroad, coupled with the message that after all, the world had accepted this after time, the Armenian genocide, and they would come to accept what was happening to the Jews as well. In the end, they didn't carry this project out, but I think it illustrates their mindset at the time. And I would argue the role of the Armenian genocide for the 20th century even goes further. Let me paint you two more very broad stroke short pictures here. One concerns the path traveled by war and violence across the map of the world, and the other one, the divide between civilians and the military or combatants in war. Throughout the 19th century, and I'm sure you all know that, the European colonial powers continued to solidify their rule across the world. They continued to divide up the rest. And until pretty much there was nothing left to divide up amongst them anymore. This consolidation of colonial rule produced a lot of violence. And we will have an endless list of cases here to discuss. And then towards the end of the 19th century, they looked to gobble up more spaces on the global map. And then the Ottoman and the Muslim spaces came into view. The French took over much of Northern Africa, the British Egypt, and then the Italians had their eyes on what is today Libya. And I would argue that violence and war traveled towards Europe from the colonial space. You could establish a line that leads from taking over, for example, Tunis, Tunisia, Libya, to the Balkan Wars, and from there to World War I. This also means, I would argue, that violence traveled along this kind of a path. Just think about colonial violence and the way it escalated up until World War I. You could mention the British case, widely debated in the years before World War I across the world, where in South Africa, famously, colonial violence had targeted the Dutch-speaking populations of South Africa in the Boer Wars. Here you had also for the first time large-scale internment of civilian populations in what was called at the time concentration camps. When Italy failed to conquer Ottoman Libya just before the Balkan Wars, before World War I, when they failed to do so quickly, and here Enver Pasha was instrumental in organizing the jihadi resistance against the Italians, when they failed, they escalated, not only by massacring civilians in Libya, but also towards the Balkans, bombarding Beirut, for example, and then finally also occupying the Dodecanese Islands. We estimate that in the course of the war and the subsequent various pacification campaigns in Libya, up to 1 in every 5 Libyans was incarcerated in camps and prisons in Libya and Italy. And then, of course, after Libya came the Balkan Wars with all the atrocities and refugees, and then came World War I. And now it's crucial to remember that until World War I, there hadn't been a major war in Europe for quite a long time. The last one of note, or the last ones of note, were the wars of German unification, culminating in the war against France and the proclamation of the German Empire in Paris. So you could argue that violence and wars that had been confined to the colonial space had made their way back to Europe. And in the colonial space, all sorts of justifications had been needed: race, civilization, uncivilization, and such, to justify brutally oppressing and even destroying local populations. The Armenian Genocide and the broader topic, how they were discussed, rationalized, and justified also in Europe, and also since the 1890s, were an important stepping stone in this broader path of violence back to Europe. And finally, another picture, one that evolves around the distinction between civilians and soldiers in war. The core argument here is that we, the world, have come to see civilians as relatively expendable in wartime. It sounds horrible enough, but I think empirically speaking, we could make this argument also in recent years and decades. Think back a few centuries. In the 18th and 19th century especially, you have this new development, this push for modern armies, which became armies of conscripts. Compulsory military service was introduced, as you know, concurrent with developments in nationalism and the rise of the modern state. Now, you would have mainly your own citizens drafted into armies when you needed, bigger armies to wage war in times of conflict. One of the ideas back then, and still up into the 20th century and beyond, whenever there's a debate between specialized professional soldier armies and citizen soldier armies, the idea was always that when you send your own citizen soldiers into battle, you would have an interest to minimize loss and not to wage futile and aggressive wars, where you would lose a lot of your own citizens, basically sending them into battles that didn't need to be fought. The empirical side of history, of course, does not support this argument at all. Perhaps also, unfortunately, these new armies were mostly used in new kinds of war with new kinds of military technology as well. And it is in this context why the killing fields of northern France in World War I were so shocking to contemporaries. You had huge armies in a lethal standoff. For almost no visible gains, tens of thousands of your own citizen soldiers slaughtered again and again. And you had leaderships which were willing to sacrifice their own citizen soldiers again and again. But in World War I, the distinction between combatant soldier and civilians was dissolved on many fronts and many occasions. You had large-scale deportations of civilian populations. For example, in Russia, where the Jews of the Western provinces were suspected to be pro-German. The Germans did their first experience in aerial bombardment with Zeppelins over London. With the project of global jihad and by igniting the Bolshevik revolution, Germany was quite comfortable with setting the world on fire with no regard to civilian life. Truly total war. And then, of course, there was also the Armenian Genocide. And all of these are not unconnected. They all, for contemporaries, seem to be connected. There was something new going on, this distinction between soldiers and civilians. Two instances from Britain, both from during World War I. Winston Churchill, he argued for the use of poison gas at the Gallipoli landing, the invasion of the Anzac forces to capture Istanbul. He was for poison gas and he cited for his argument in his support what was happening to the Armenians as proof that the Turks had forfeited the right to civilized warfare anyway. This was an internal discussion, internal policy debates. There was also more open talk connecting these topics. Lord Bryce, a very prominent pro-Armenian activist, argued in an open and published letter to the London Times in October 1915. He argued against aerial bombardment of German cities, warning not to stoop to the level of barbarism displayed by what was happening to the Armenians at the time. But all this blurring of lines between civilians and real soldier combatants, all of that also prepared the ground for World War II, where it wasn't only the Germans who saw civilian life as expendable, the Germans, of course, on a huge and massive super genocidal scale, but also the Allies found civilian life more expendable than they had in the past. And you, of course, can see that in their bombing war of Germany and Europe, massively killing civilians, often forgotten today, also not only German civilians. For example, in France, more civilians, more French people were killed by Allied bombs than were Londoners killed during the Blitz by German bombs, just as an example. And all of this, of course, brings us closer to today and to all the wars that followed afterwards in the 20th century. Looking back at how people discussed warfare and civilian life and the worth of civilian life in the time before World War I, and then, covering the time up until where we are today, you can see a rapid escalation of what becomes more and more acceptable. And I argue the Armenian Genocide is a crucial, important stepping stone in this history of, you could say, violence in the 20th century and the modern world. And this already brings me close to my concluding words, but I hope you can see the Armenian Genocide is not disconnected or peripheral to overall modern history at all. I argue it's quite central to many of these developments in the modern world. I only mentioned a few here in my talk today, and I'm sure many of these things are rather obvious to most of the audience today who are thinking or working on the Armenian Genocide. But again, I would urge you to have a look at how, what role, what place the Armenian Genocide has in high school teaching around the world, in the general history, in discourses of history today. And I have to say, again, we live in an amazing time when it comes to the history writing of the Armenian Genocide. We have great standard and fundamental histories. We have specialized new studies. I argue we have really truly reached a point of consolidation in the last 2 decades. We are now opening our eyes to so many other different topics and areas we are interested in, and our group is ever changing, of course. But I think there's one problem we are facing now, despite new developments in genocide recognition across the world. And this is another product of over 100 years of Turkish denialism. This denialism, this ongoing denialism from 1915 onwards has marginalized the topic, has made many historians and also others around the world too afraid to touch it. When I was a student, I always heard this from specialists, oh, the Armenian genocide, that's too complicated, better not discuss it too much or research on it at all. This denialism has basically hurt everybody in the world because it kept us from learning from the Armenian genocide. It kept us from learning from it, and it kept us from better understanding the history of our modern contemporary world. This, as I said, is not new to most of you listening today, I'm sure, but it's still shocking that this kind of effect of denialism goes so far beyond, the people involved in these topics as survivor descendants, as successor countries, as historians working on it. It has massively impacted our understanding, our common and global understanding of the 20th century. It has hurt everybody, and I think we have a lot of work to do on this front. Thank you very much. Mark, you're silent.
Right. Thank you so much, Stefan. So your talk raises a lot of questions, and I kind of want to start maybe at the end. I would certainly agree with you about the profound and far-reaching effects of denial of the Armenian genocide that has gone on for over a century. It continues today, not just from the government of Turkey, but also from various people and entities who are supportive of the government of Turkey's agenda, either explicitly or implicitly. In the face of that, then, as a scholar, how do you work either around that or confront it directly, or what means do you see of dealing with it without engaging, I presume, in a debate with it?
Okay, what do you mean without engaging in a debate with it?
Well, my presumption is that engaging in a debate with genocide deniers is only going to create further opportunities for denial and the elevation of denial to an equal side in a scholarly controversy. So without engaging in that, how do you reckon with the phenomenon?
Okay, this basically involves two things: combating denialism, and the other one pushing the topic to be included and recognized. Yeah, given the atmosphere as it is today, I don't see too much point in confronting outright denialists, because there is in Turkey at the moment no vocal other side of the spectrum, or it's too much intimidated. In the past, this was a little bit different, I felt. Abroad, I think we're always building coalitions with sensible historians, for example, and sensible colleagues in the field, and we are able to reach these people. And I do think that recognition of the genocide helped a little bit in all these different contexts. It has become just simply a little bit less acceptable to have, let's say, people with a certain denialist demeanor present in, various contexts. I think what we can do, we can, as historians teaching at universities, we can try to include the Armenian genocide in topics where it's usually not part of. Try our best to present new perspectives on old topics, and this is, I think, a very fruitful perspective on a lot of topics, and it's very important. And as I said, it's not made up. It really was part of so many of these developments as they unfolded. I think I'm going off your question a little bit off script here, but it's not easy. I think one of the things that motivates me to give a talk like this and to stay deeply connected to the topic is this feeling that it's just a certain group of people working and talking about it, and that denialism has been so successful in turning such a global topic into a niche topic, kind of. This is what I'm really uncomfortable with, and yeah.
Yes, it's succeeded in making the topic somewhat radioactive for the most part. It's been very successful in that regard, I'm sorry to say. Very specific question here is about your thoughts on the argument recently presented by Hans Lucas Kieser in his biography of Talat Pasha, that Talat ushered in what Hobsbawm once described as the age of extremes in the 20th century, i.e. Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, etc. What is your feeling on that argument of Kieser's?
Well, in general, I'm agreeing with Hans Lucas Kieser. I don't have much to say on that, to be honest. There's no doubt, that basically similar motivations, similar policy goals as the others of this lineup you just constructed here for the age of extreme is shared by Talat Pasha and also by Enver Pasha. These are really extremist, let's say, politicians and leaders. They have a totalitarian view of life, the nation, and of the world. There is nothing taboo, nothing goes too far. This is the common thread amongst them. There's this, there's this idea basically that everything now can be reworked and redone, and that human lives don't matter really. This kind of totalitarian outlook is shared amongst them. For sure, I think.
Another question is on the issue of recognition. Now, you spoke in your presentation about recognition being insufficient in itself, but over the past 5 to 10 years, we have seen a significant increase in recognition in Germany, for example. In 2019, both houses of the US Congress. What impact do you see this increase in recognition having on the scholarship in particular?
On the scholarship, that's not easy to say, actually. I think before already, for some time, when it comes to the history of the Armenian Genocide, really we reached this phase of consolidation, and then going beyond it now, really, with books like by Raymond Kevorkian, then also for the centennial, Sunni had a nice short history of the Armenian Genocide. In Germany, we also had good contributions to the topic. And then already before, you had many younger scholars pushing into various other perspectives and more detailed studies. I think even without this phase, this wave of recognitions, scholarship was doing quite great, I have to say. Actually, it's quite amazing what happened. And you also have, different kinds of people, joining this, growing group of scholars. As I said, also very interesting development, many from Turkey with various backgrounds as well. Recognition is very good, and it's very, it's long overdue. If this wave of recognition had happened 60 years ago, I wouldn't be so worried. But the effects of this century of denialism, they are very, ingrained. Just take a look at who's discussing our books, who's writing book reviews. Do we ever have people from general history interested in what we are doing? Who's picking up our books for teaching in university classes and other things? We stay a little bit amongst ourselves. I got a wonderful review for my Justifying Genocide by a scholar working on the Herero and the Makwa genocide, but I wanted somebody doing German history, and this is, we're running, either you can say in circles or against walls there. It's not only that it's toxic, people people are not enough interested and curious about the Armenian genocide, I fear. And this is a problem, I think. You know, like in countries like in Germany, where you had recognition, you know, now people are expecting it to be taught in schools. And how are teachers prepared for that, you know, when they are facing a truly post-Ottoman country with, you know, people who are coming not only from Turkey, but, you know, from all sorts of places that have a connection to the Ottoman Empire, either from the Christian side or from the Muslim side. These are very complex settings, and I don't see enough support there, you know, to integrate this topic. And it should come also from our colleagues, you know, from other disciplines and other fields in history. Because there's only so much we can do as specialists, I fear. Yeah.
Do you see an opportunity, Stefan, perhaps, as I think I do, at this moment, to connect the long history of denial of the Armenian genocide to the growing interest, unfortunately, necessary growing interest in denial studies and so-called post-truth, the phenomenon of post-truth that seems to have engulfed us in recent years? It seems to me there may be an opportunity there to open up this subject in a way that maybe didn't exist before.
I would agree, because if you look at the mechanisms of denial, you know, and this playing with notions of truth, you know, it's always, for example, the victim numbers, you know, this is always one of the key parts of the debate, discrediting some forms of either the document, the chain of evidence, the personality of, you know, the historian, and all of these things are very similar in all these different cases. And I think among those working on the Armenian genocide, there's a lot of expertise, you know, that would help people now facing this new kind of post-truth age, or this new Holocaust denial that's taking place in different societies around the world. I think there's a lot of, what do you say, cross-topic or cross-case expertise that could be brought together, definitely.
I just want to mention that to the people who are virtually raising their hands, if you tuned in late, perhaps you need to submit your question, if you have a question, via the Q&A function within Zoom. That is the only way I can do it. There's a question about Franz Werfel and the 40 Days of Musa. I don't know, I don't remember if this is something you address in your work or not, but do you see Werfel as having the goal in mind of informing Jews about what had happened to the Armenians in a way to encourage them to take a stand against the Nazis, or is this sort of a backwards construction on what he was doing?
This is actually one of the effects of the book, you know, because it was widely read and was actually one of the most widely read books in the ghettos that the Nazis imposed on Eastern and Central Europe. This was one of the effects of the book. The ghetto rising in Warsaw, Bialystok, and other places. Leaders from these ghetto uprisings, they left us testimony that they were inspired by Franz Werfel's book directly. But, you know, this is how I also opened my book, because I thought it was so fascinating. Franz Werfel hadn't finished his book when the Nazis came to power. The winter of 1932 to 1933, when it became clear that the Nazis would have to be included in government somehow, this was the game of coalitions of 32 was making that obvious. Werfel was touring Germany to warn the Germans about the Nazis. Not specifically necessarily the Jews, but, you know, German audiences at large. And he famously took this one chapter out of the 40 Days of Musa that he had already finished at that point, where this German pro-Armenian activist, Johannes Lepsius, meets with Enver Pasha in Istanbul and tries to get him to stop genocide in progress. And Franz Werfel, you know, in letters to his wife, he said it quite obvious, quite frankly, the Armenians are my stand-in Jews. It also means that the Young Turks were stand-in Nazis. And I only found one article on his reading tour in a German newspaper, which said the audience really understood that he's talking to them, that Lepsius is talking to them and not to Enver Pasha, and that this was about Hitler and the Nazis. And this was basically, you know, imagine that in the winter of 1932, 1933, this guy is touring Germany, reading from his book, warning them of a genocide, you know, that the Nazis might have in store. Yeah, I think that's quite fascinating. And it also tells us, you know, why would this guy choose the Armenians? You know, if they weren't known, people knew about what happened to the Armenians. They had discussed it at large, you know. This is a huge topic in interwar Germany and in the interwar world, actually.
Okay, I have another question here that since genocide studies grew out of Holocaust studies in the, I lost the question. Since genocide studies grew out of Holocaust studies in the 1970s and 80s, did this hinder what you say is the need to take a more globalized historical view of the Armenian genocide? So did Holocaust studies create a framework that was sort of imposed on genocide studies as a whole that may have limited the view?
I don't think I would agree with such a reading of the history of the field. We have to remember also that Holocaust studies didn't have a fast, what do you say, takeoff. It took quite some time, wasn't easy. Similar problems also as we had faced in the study of the Armenian Genocide, the role of, you know, witness survivor testimony, for example, similar problems, you know, it took for a long time. Also there for survivor testimonies to be included in the general histories, similar topics and similar problems. I think what hurt integrating the Armenian genocide into our broader view of things actually is something that took place in Germany, the so-called historians' quarrel, where one historian kind of ventured from a right-centrist position to the far right and claimed, Ernst Nolte his name, and claimed that basically Nazism was just a reaction to what the Bolsheviks were doing and the threat they posed, and kind of tried to use his really good knowledge of international contexts to deflect guilt away from the Germans, you know. And this was a very unproductive debate that had as one of the effects that people didn't do much on the international kind of background on National Socialism for a long time. And I think a book like Ataturk in the Nazi Imagination wouldn't have really been possible 20, 30 years ago, because people would have accused me to, you know, deflect guilt from the Germans, which I don't see this at all as part of the argument. Actually, I think it increases the guilt of the Germans. If they have been exposed to a case of genocide, had a long genocide debate, and kind of had the time, you know, years before Hitler came to power in still a democracy, to think about what genocide means, and then go about doing their own genocide, that doesn't take any guilt away from them. You know, there is agency in history, and if you're better informed, it only burdens your, what do you say, decision-making more. It makes you more guilty, not less. But this, I think, was kind of streamlined the history of fascism, also the history of the Holocaust, and all these different developments into a more national perspective. And if you look in your books, you know, a history of the Nazis is always a national history. It's always about German history, as if the Nazis were not aware of what was going on in the world around them, you know. So this is a general trend. It's also a general historian's trend. Most histories are national histories. Most chairs in universities used to be national, you know, history inspired or, you know, guided. This is something we're just breaking up in the last decades, really. And, you know, global history is a trend, and, you know, I'm optimistic for the future, but, you know, this topic has an especially, what do you say, large wall constructed around it, really, that has to be overcome.
I have something of a comment here, which may prompt a question, which I'm going to condense a bit, and I apologize if I do not do it full justice. Regarding the issue of how to integrate the Armenian genocide into more general studies, The opinion is that this will only happen when Turkey, and especially the Ottoman Empire, is itself integrated into our histories of Europe, because Turkey in the post-World War I era has been put in the Middle East, which is or has been mostly a marginal topic in the West. Your comment on that, perhaps?
Yeah, I would agree actually with that entirely. I mean, this is also a problem that you have with this whole topic, of Germany and the Middle East as well. This is such a marginalized topic. I have Turkish friends who came to see exhibitions in Berlin on World War I, and they were shocked to find the pictures on the Ottoman Empire in the staircase, basically in between proper exposition parts, And of course, you need a lot of background to understand what's going on, but I still think that there are different contexts where the Armenian genocide could be inserted, punctually. The history of violence, the civilian combatant distinction, and many other places, without going into the full depth of it,
I'm hesitant to ask this question of you, Stefan, or any person, but I'll ask it anyway, even though I don't see a positive response coming. Do you see any scenario where Turkey acknowledges the Armenian genocide and a process of reparation and whatever may come after recognition by Turkey can unfold?
Yeah, I think there are all kinds of historians. I tend to be more of these historians who also understands that sometimes change can come very quick. It's not always gradual change that builds up. I was very optimistic about Turkey in the early 2000s. And I still want to be, change can come quite easily. I think there is under the covers, there's a lot more, what do you mean, consensus of what happened, and people are much more interested. And you could see that in the 2000s, there was more public debate, many of the main books on the Armenian genocide are translated and published there. I always thought it's in the interest of Turkey to come to terms with this topic. And I think it really is, and in a different kind of, leadership situation in Turkey, I think this could be realized. It's also for Turkey a very cumbersome topic. They spend a lot of energy on it. It's very cumbersome, I think. I don't think it's helpful at all to continue this line. And let's say I'm optimistic.
We should probably end on a note of optimism then, Stefan. So then let me say again, thank you so much, Stefan, for your presentation today, for your publications to date, and for those that you're working on and that we will be seeing in the future. Thank you so much. Absolutely, it's been a long time coming, and we're very happy that it finally took place, even if under unusual circumstances. I want to thank again Maggie and the Ararat Eskegin Museum, and Bedros Dermatosyan, and all at the Society for Armenian Studies for their co-sponsorship and support of this event. And of course, I want to thank everybody who participated today on Zoom or on YouTube, or who will be watching this in the future. So thank you, and we'll see you again. Bye, Stefan. Thank you.
Bye-bye.